You guys asked for it. Today's the day. We're painting a space wolf and making the most epic snow base ever. Hey, you're watching Squidmar Miniatures and I am Emil. My original plan was to make a simple contrast paint space wolf tutorial. But if you know me, I like to have fun in my hobby and I just wasn't excited about making a contrast paint tutorial. Instead, I thought it would be a fun challenge to paint something at like a competition level, and I show you the steps I take and how I got to painting this space wolf and how I got to that high level. And also, to be honest, I think this snow base is probably one of my favorite bases I've ever done, and I do a lot of bases, so hang around, check out the video. I think you might learn a lot and have some fun. And also, I just opened a website, and on that website, if you ever wondered what gear I use or which airbrush I have, which brushes I use or whatever, I put some links to all of the things I use on a regular basis on that website. So if you ever want to buy something that you see me using in a video, a good place to start is by checking my website squidmar.com. I also put some links to merch you can buy there, either the black one or the white one. So if you want some of that stuff, just check out my website squidmar.com and let's start building. When I paint a competition piece, I always like to start with the face. And in this case, I'm using the same technique as I used in the Warcry Untamed Beast painting tutorial. I put the link up in the right corner here so you can check it out if you're interested in learning how to paint skin. The colors I'm using is Citadel Bugman's Glow, and then I go up to Cadian Flesh Tone, and Kislev Flesh, and the final highlight is Vallejo Pale Flesh. Or as in this case, I use White Flesh, but these are incredibly similar. And I'm basing his beard and hair with Storm Vermin Fur, going up and highlighting it with Morghast Bone. And the final highlight for this one is mixing in a little bit of white into the Morghast Bone. And when I paint something for a competition, I usually like to be a bit more careful than I usually am. When I paint something that's just for me, I usually just slap on colors, work heavily with thick layers. When I do something that I want to be almost perfect or as good as I can make it, I like to thin my paints a little bit more. Not so that it's super thin glazes, but I want to make sure that I don't spill over to different parts when I handle it, and I want to make sure that all the transitions are smooth. So what I do with the skin here is I'm a bit more careful going between every color. So, for example, when going from Bugman's Glow up to Cadian Flesh Tone, I make sure that I have colors placed everywhere I want it. And before I even think about going to Kislev Flesh, I make sure that the application and the placement of all the Cadian Flesh Tone is perfect. And if it's not, I just glaze thin layers upon the previous ones and just, as I said, make sure to be a bit more careful than I usually am when I just paint. Maybe with force is the right word. And one thing that I did differently here from when I painted the Untamed Beasts is that because I want to tell a story about the environment this guy is in. So he's in the blistering cold, so I wanted to make sure that you have like the red skin where the skin has frozen a bit from the cold. So in all the shadow parts, I glazed Mephiston red in just to make sure that it has like this red cold sheen to the skin. So I did this on his cheekbones and on his nose mainly. And that's where it naturally would be more red when you're out in the cold. So for the non-metallic gold I use 4 different colors. Vallejo Gold Brown, Mornfang Brown, Flash Gitz Yellow, and Rhinox Hide, and of course I add a little bit of white as I often do with the final highlight. And when painting non-metallic metal, the focus isn't on which paint you use, but about how you place the highlights. And this is a circular shape, so you see I place the first highlight as a circle on the top. And because snow will be reflecting a lot of light, I also added a small highlight on the bottom side of the armor part. And I just start by shaping the light, and when I've done the first 2 layers, I start glazing between these two. So I get a good feel for how the light would hit the armor if it looks good, and then I do the perfecting of the armor part. And when I paint for a competition, I like to finish every part of the miniature separately. And there are plenty of good reasons why I want to do this. But the main one is mainly for consistency. I want to make sure that every part is finished and that every part has the top level that I can make it. If I jump back from part to part, I might forget that I haven't finished something or just get complacent and be satisfied with what I've done earlier, even though it isn't perfect. And when I'm done with the kneecap, I just go on and start doing this to the other parts of the miniature that's going to be in gold. I then started with the dark gray blue armor parts. And you might think that, oh, this guy, he's painted for a while and he just nails everything the first time. But the truth is, I actually repainted the first dark armor parts 3 times before I got satisfied with the color that I found good enough for this piece. I start with the color dark sea blue. My first highlight is Stegadon scale green, and then I keep mixing this one, adding a bit more and more white for every highlight layer that I add. And as with the gold part and with the face, when I paint this, I paint every part separately. So here you can see me paint the shoulder pad of the lieutenant. And I use a lot of the technique wet blending when painting armor. But I keep jumping back and forth between wet blending and stippling and glazing. And learning all of these techniques and mastering them really helped me in the painting process, because when I come across a problem or when I have something that I need to fix or paint, I know which technique to use because I've used them before and I've practiced them throughout the miniatures. So if you want to get better and faster at painting miniatures, learning all these different techniques gives you a much better foundation to stand on when you want to paint something. And if you're just getting started and you don't know where to place highlights, using a reference, either a miniature from Golden Demon or a painting by one of Games Workshop artists, is a really good way of learning where to place highlights and how light works. But if you want to learn the technical part and the physics of the shape of light, Pirate Monkey Painting has done an awesome tutorial about where to place lights depending on which material it is and how it's shaped. It's a bit more on the technical side, as I said, but I'll link the video in the description down below. The fur on his back is painted with Rhinox hide, Bane Blade brown and Wraithbone white. And I paint this on not using dry brushing or highlighting with layers. I do this as a single wet blend just to get the shapes of the miniature. Because if you check a reference picture up on Google, for example, of a fur, you will find that fur isn't dry brushed hard edges on a fur, but it's something soft and the light shapes the fur and gives it volume. So it's time to start building the base, and I have 2 incredible references. One of them is the Crystal Brush winner Ruben Martinez, and what he did with his Ulrich the Slayer is just fantastic. The other reference is actually another YouTuber called Mesgaik, and he did this really cool thing with a Blood Angel submerged under ice, and we're going to try to replicate that and mix the 2 bases together to create the perfect one to tell our story. So I start with one of these 3D printed bases. If you don't have a 3D printer, you can just cut a hole from one of the normal bases and just cover the bottom with some plastic or a plastic card. And to create the submerged Space Marine, we first have to slay it a little bit. When it's been cut off its sprue, I have to cut the body in half. I then use a regular sanding paper to just sand down the body to maybe 1/3 of its original thickness. And we want to make sure that it's thin enough so that when I pour in some resin later, it will cover the whole body. There won't be anything sticking up from the eyes. And when I glued the torso, I accidentally placed it a bit too close to the edge, so I had to use a Dremel to drill out some of the edge so I could fit a head in there as well. And then I sanded the head the same way as I did with the body. I then chose an arm without a weapon, so it kind of looks like he's reaching out from the eyes. And don't forget to check out Meskike's YouTube channel as well. As I mentioned, he came out with this idea originally and he has some great tutorials on there. My friend Marcus has one of these Woodland Scenics rock molds. And he gave me a few of these casted in casting plaster that looks like real rocks. So I just try to place a few of them to see if I can find a good fit and a good reference size for the plateau that I'm building for our Space Wolf. The base shape of the plateau is built using cork from IKEA. I then glued the casted rocks onto the cork. They had a bit of a trouble sticking to the cork, so I used some sand as sort of a cement to just get it to stick and keep in place. Because sand and super glue is rock hard. To fill the gaps between these rock parts, I used milliput. This is a 2-component sculpting clay that is really easy to use for sculpting. So I just mix the 2 parts together and start placing them where I want them. I dip my fingers in some water and just start pushing it around to kind of fill out all the places where I want it to be. And I'm really not a good sculptor, but you'll see that it looks quite good anyways, because rocks are quite easy to sculpt. I have some silicone sculpting tools, but you can use pretty much anything. Just make sure that it's a bit wet so it doesn't stick to the sculpting tool. When it had dried, I started base painting everything with Fenrisian grey in the brighter parts and the dark sea blue in the shadow parts. Just slapping these on there using wet blending to get a good feel for this snowy mountain part. I then sketched some of the volumes using just regular white while the paint was still wet. And I've never painted a snowy mountain before, so I kind of had to figure out as I went along how to paint this thing. And it's totally fine to not succeed the first time, because in the end I changed almost all of the colors that is on this base. The Blood Angel is painted using the same technique as I did with how to paint a Blood Angel using contrast paint video I did 2 months ago. So you can check that video out using the link up in the right corner here. I also painted some red around the Blood Angel, and this is to create the illusion that you can see the Marine's body just sunken into the deeper parts of the water. And when the Marine was finished, I glazed it with a bit of blue ink, but you can use a blue wash or just a blue glaze from any blue color that you have at home. And this is to get it more of a cold, cool feel. I also glazed some Temple Guard blue on the edge of the base and closest to the ice mountain on the base. Well, we're gonna create some of the ice using this Green Stuff World UV resin. And you can use any 2-component resin or water effects doing this. But this one gets rock hard in 30 seconds when I use this UV LED torch compared to like the 2-component resins that takes 24 hours to dry properly. So I just added a layer of the resin onto the base and used the UV torch to set it hard, and it took maybe 30 to 60 seconds and it's rock hard. So I had to do this a couple of times because when it sets, it shrinks a little bit. And if you get any air bubbles in the resin when you pour it, just use a toothpick or something to pop the bottle before you set everything with the UV torch. And to blend everything together, you need to make sure that you have a thin layer that also goes around up on the edge of the base. And when everything had set, it kind of had withdrew a bit from the edges and expanded downwards for some reason. So I had to add a bit extra just on the sides of the base, and I will have to sand the bottom of the base to make it flat again. When the resin has dried hard, we want to sand around on the ice to kind of create micro scratches on it. You don't want to sand on top of the marine because you want that one to be visible and clear. But all the way around, and I cleaned it a bit with some isopropanol alcohol. You can probably use water to just clean everything up and just leave the scratches. And for some reason I jumped back into painting the rocks again. I dry brushed some white just using strokes from above hitting downwards. This gave me a good feel of the volumes of the rocks. With a better feel for the volumes, I went in again stippling and wet blending some Sotek green, Temple Guard blue and dark sea blue on the different places. Just slapping everything on with a large dry brush to get a good glacier feel of this snowy mountain. To create the icy rock part, we use the Woodland Scenic's rock molds again. I lubricate the mold using some regular dish soap put on with a regular brush. I then just pour some of the Green Stuff World UV resin and use the torch to set it hard. This looks exactly like ice. I've impressed myself. That's not bad. This could actually be used in product photography, because this looks like ice. Not fake ice, but ice, acrylic ice. So I'm gonna paint some skulls, because I want some skulls to be in there. Just like old parts lying around in the cold from some old battle, and yeah, I'm just super impressed by this. So I just added these skulls like one at a time. First some UV resin and then the first skull. Setting that and then adding a bit more resin and adding the second skull. This way I get some good depth in this ice piece. And I don't have all of the skulls in the same place at the same depth. This really gave the ice mountain a organic feel. And when I had a couple of icy rock parts, I just glue them using some super glue. And then I've tried to fill the gaps using this UV resin, just pouring a few drops and then setting it with the UV torch. And this is not going to fill everything out, and that's totally fine because we're going to add some snow effects later, and this is going to cover all the gaps that are visible right now. So it's back to painting a bit again. I'm glazing some more of the Temple Guard blue, but this time I glaze it on top of the ice. And this really blends the background of the black base together with the ice. It's now time to place some of the snow on the base. I use the Green Stuff World Realistic Snow Flock. I mix this with some PVA glue and just use a tool, this time a coffee stirrer, to just place it around on the base where I wanted it. But you can also place PVA glue directly onto the base and just sprinkle some of this snow flock on to get a really cool effect. I used both of these techniques to great success on different parts here, and whenever I got some excess of the flock sprinkled somewhere where I didn't want it, I just used a cheap brush to brush the snow effects away. And to get some fine details around the marine, I just used a toothpick and placed some PVA glue and then sprinkled more of the snow effects there. And now we're gonna create some icicles. To get a good base for this, I just cut some plastic pieces from an old plastic blister pack. I glue these in place using some super glue. And to make these look icy, use the magic of the Vallejo water texture water effects. This is like a heavy gel, and when it dries transparent. So in this setting, it really looks like ice. So I was kind of running out of time to finish this model for the release of this video. But this is where I'm at right now, and we need to pin the model to the base. So I drill a hole where I think the miniature would fit the best. I glue it in place, and to blend everything together I use some of the snow flock and put some glue around the foot to just blend everything perfectly. And now it's time to paint the weapon parts. I based it with some contrast paint, Black Templar. I then base it with Demonette hide, and then I just use a regular white to increase the highlights step by step. And the placement of the highlights here is once again the most important thing to really sell the effect of it being metal, even though there is no metal pigments in the paints. I kind of semi-rushed through this part to finish everything for the video, but I think you really get a good feel of how I paint my non-metallic metal. When I had placed all the highlights and I was happy with the transitions, I glazed some of the Mephiston red on the bottom and the top part of the axe, removing the excess with my thumb. I also glazed some parts with Temple Guard blue, and these two colors really give a nice contrast between one another, and it makes it look like the weapon is reflecting some of the environment. And this is where I'm at right now. Once I've actually finished all of the details of the miniature, the last 5%, I'm going to add some of this snow effect to the miniature as well, because right now he's standing clean on top of a windy, snowy mountain, and that's not super realistic. So we want to add some of the effect to the miniature as well. I'm also going to add a crack into the ice where the Space Marine is lying underneath the ice, and I think that will be about it. So I hope you learned something from watching me paint this one up. I hope you liked the end result of the figure, and if you did, consider checking out my Patreon page, maybe pledging a few dollars to help me run this channel and just have a lot of fun with miniatures. So don't forget to check out the website squidmar.com for all the tools that I use when I build and paint, and check out some merch if you like that stuff. I almost forgot. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any questions, and maybe tell a friend if you think they might enjoy this video or learn something from it. Once again, thanks to all my Patreon supporters for making sure that I can do this, and Albin Åström, of course, the top Patreon supporter. Thanks.